Hello, Mr. Sapers. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Very happy to have this privilege to interview you again. I'm happy that we're going to be having today a discussion that is on a very important subject, and that is prisoners' rights. There is a lot of media attention about prisons and what's going on in prisons. Some of the information out there is accurate. Sometimes there are some misconceptions that we can see, and there's definitely also a public misconception, I think, about people who are in custody. So I think it's very important to talk about their rights and to clarify what the situation is and how the jail conditions are for people who are in custody, those who are waiting for trial, because there is a distinction between those who are waiting for trial, who are still presumed innocent, versus those who are serving a sentence. And maybe we can get into that. So let's start maybe by talking about people who are in custody. Not everyone is already convicted of a crime. Some of them are still awaiting their trial, and so they're presumed innocent. What are their rights at that stage?
Sure. Well, let me say that this was always a significant part of my work dealing with the law and the laws regarding incarceration, whether it be sentenced or pretrial. It's particularly a focus of mine these days as I'm now the executive director for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And of course, we challenge when rights are threatened or been taken away in court. And one of our major pillars is criminal justice, and that definitely engages prisoners' rights. So the easy answer to your question is that everybody who's charged with an offense and ends up in pretrial custody has the same charter protections as everybody else.
Mhm.
The charter follows people behind jail and prison doors.
Yeah.
So when somebody goes into pretrial custody, there's supposed to be due process. There's law that specifies what that due process should look like before people are denied bail. And once they're incarcerated, there's statutes that govern how correctional services operate, and those are enforceable laws in terms of obligations. And of course, all as I say, all the rights, the legal rights you have, the legal right of to be protected from illegal search and seizure, to be deprived of your liberty without legal cause, all of those things, access to health care, your fundamental freedom to practice your religion. So there's this notion somehow that either people who go into jail lose all their rights and they can be treated any way you want
Yeah.
to because they have no rights. Or the flip side of that is that somehow people who are involved with criminal justice process have special rights, that they have better rights or rights, greater rights than victims of crime, let's say, have. Neither of those two things are true. The charter applies to everybody, regardless of your legal status. Now, I will say this: when you're in a place of custody, you do lose some mobility rights. And so the way the law works is that all of the rights that you had before you were incarcerated follow you into prison, except for those that are necessarily limited by the fact that you're incarcerated.
Mhm.
So obviously you can't just say, "Hey, listen, I'm going to a movie now," and walk out the back door
Yeah.
of the jail. That's
Yeah.
that's not that's against the law as well. So so in a nutshell, that's the rights. Now, there are some things that are also constitutional principles or common law principles that also govern the way that people are handled. So you cannot be so the way that flows through, let's say you are an older prisoner, or you have a prisoner with physical disabilities, or you have language, neither French or English is your first language, or you're gender diverse. And so for some of those populations, it's other areas of law that kick in. Now, it could be covered under some of the fundamental freedom sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it could also be that accommodations have been made, or that provincial disability law, for example, if it's a provincial or a territorial jail, that local jurisdiction's laws around services to be provided with people with disabilities, which would include mental health disabilities.
Hmm.
And of course, a huge proportion of the in custody population have either suspected or diagnosed mental health issues. So, or substance misuse issues, or sometimes comorbidity with both. So sometimes there's other legal protections that come into place, but again, they're the same protections that you would have as a citizen of that jurisdiction, whether you were in custody or not. And we've seen litigation that sort of establishes these principles. So, for example, years ago, it was established that federally sentenced offenders did not lose their right to vote in an election.
Hmm.
You're not sentenced
Yeah,
to be, you're not dismissed or excommunicated from the democratic process because you're in prison. Um, so there's other things that you're not sentenced for. You're not sentenced to be denied health care. So there is an expectation that every Canadian will get the healthcare they need when they need it. We all know what the struggles are in the community in terms of accessing healthcare. Well, those struggles are magnified in a prison or a jail.
exactly. Yeah.
But there is a right, there is a legal obligation on the part of the state to ensure access to healthcare, at least to a community standard. So again, they don't get gold-plated healthcare, they don't get to jump the line, but they must get healthcare equal to the community standard because most people are in jail for a very small part of their life. You know, most people go to jail, they do their time, they pay for their crime that way, and then they're released. Uh, but an interruption in their health care, particularly if they have a chronic illness, could be fatal.
Right.
You know you can't deny people that treatment and access to that care. So anyway, I think so. That's sort of the general answer in terms of the retained rights that follow you behind the prison, and then some of the things that happen because there's other legal guarantees that apply to all Canadians, including those that are in conflict with the law.
But to go back on the point, let's say, for example, of healthcare, that they're entitled to not better, but at least equal
Mhm.
to the standards in the community. The problem is, though, that what we see on a practical level is that they don't have equal access. It's very difficult. There are waiting lists in jail sometimes for people to who are in custody to either meet a medical professional or to get the services that are required. So, I mean, that's the thing that yes, technically they can have, and sometimes some judges at sentencing, they'll say, oh, well, if he has this condition, that's not a problem. He can still get the treatment he needs in jail. But we know that in reality, that's either not going to happen or it's going to happen, but there's a lot of waiting that's going to happen before he can have access to that. So, what about that issue, though?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. So I did lay out what the law says.
Hmm.
But we have not yet really talked very much
Yeah,
about what the reality is. And you make an excellent point. For 12 years, I was the correctional investigator of Canada. And during that 12 years,
yeah.
my office received, well, probably hundreds of thousands, well, let's just say tens of thousands
Hmm.
of complaints from prisoners, federally sentenced prisoners, and or their families. For 10 of those 12 years, the number one category of complaints had to do with the access to and quality of healthcare. And that's everything from being able to see a doctor to being able to be referred to a specialist to actually getting to see a specialist to be getting to have timely escorts to get out of the prison, perhaps to a hospital to get those specialized services. And sometimes this included things like chemotherapy for cancer treatment
Hmm.
or dialysis for kidney disease.
Yeah.
So very important that this be done in a timely way. Access to psychiatrists, having medications reviewed and prescribed. So it's just about everything you can imagine in terms of being able to have some autonomy over your healthcare, and be able to get the healthcare you need, has been problematic in a prison setting. And it's not to make a pun, but it's chronically So it's chronically a problem. It continues to be a problem. Um, and if somebody comes into a prison and they're taking some kind of pain management medication or some kind of psychotropic medication for mood, and those medications are considered to be a security risk in the prison, then that treatment stops. And they have to wait to see a prison doctor and then be started on a new regime of meds, which may or may not be as effective. And that's is broken again when they're released from prison. They may be able to find a doctor in the community. They may be able to go back to their former uh, medication,
Mhm.
but they may not be able to, or it may
Yeah,
take years.
yeah.
So sometimes um, the experience of being incarcerated actually can make somebody's illness much worse.
Right. Well, also for especially for the mentally ill, like if there's a mental health problem, and again, we're not talking here about the case where there's a mental health problem, the person is then found NCR or unfit, where there is a problem, but it doesn't meet the legal standard for these concepts. Sometimes also just being in a prison setting in detention will make it worse, will make whatever that condition is, whether it's severe depression or, I mean,
Yeah,
bipolar, I don't know. So sometimes also the setting itself can make the condition worse.
yeah. No, and we see huge prevalence of things like major depression,
Yeah,
insomnia, anxiety
yeah,
disorders. People who have been stable with their dealing with their mental illness for years destabilize. We see acute phases of chronic diseases more frequently while people are in custody than not in custody. We see increases in self-injurious behavior, suicide and suicide attempt. Um, uh, so yeah, just about everything gets magnified due to just to the stress and the circumstances, the tension, the
yeah,
hypervigilance that happens inside a jail or a prison. So if you already have trouble sleeping, it's going to get worse. If you're
yeah.
already depressed, it's going to get worse. If you're already anxious, it's going to get worse. Um, if you already have an eating disorder, it's going to get worse. So that's the and there's some gender differences.
Hmm.
So women are much more prone to self-injury in a prison than men. So the prevalence of self-injury amongst female federal offenders is much higher than with male. And so the way that people cope with their incarceration is very gendered as well. Um, and the access to healthcare and the healthcare needs are also different. Now, if you throw into that gender diversity, so if you throw into that mix a trans
Yeah.
prisoner, a transgender prisoner, well, now you've got all kinds of issues where even if there wasn't a significant psychological stress before, there is now, just because you may be housed in a penitentiary setting that is contrary to your gender identity,
Hmm.
and that creates problems.
Well, and that also creates sometimes problems with other inmates who may also feel uncomfortable with I mean, the it's a particularly difficult and delicate situation when we're dealing with a transgender person who's in jail because there's going to be some people who are not going to accept that or who are going to say that they feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah. It's very difficult. And personally, I was involved in an investigation
Hmm.
into a tragedy. But if you go back a little bit in time, one of the precursors of this tragedy was a trans woman, but who lived as a woman but still had male genitalia, and the was housed in a women's institution
Hmm.
for a very short period of time. But the other women were very threatened
Yeah.
by her presence
Hmm.
um, because of her physiology. So so you have to be sensitive to both sets of needs, and sadly, this situation resulted in a death by suicide. And um, it was months after it had been thought to have been resolved, but it had never been properly resolved. And so this is the kind of very serious consequences.
Well, and especially if we're talking about situations where we're seeing it's sadly becoming more and more common, where there are a lot of there's more than like there's like triple bunking where we have multiple inmates in the same cell, for example, in some prisons, and that's a bit of a problem. I mean, there isn't enough space, there isn't enough capacity, and there is an overcrowding of jails. And it's very difficult to meet the needs of all these individuals with the resources or the limited resources that are available. So, um, what is the solution here, Mr. Saper?
Well, okay. And this does engage the earlier part of our conversation
Hmm.
about the rights. So you have rights to personal safety and autonomy.
Yeah,
You have rights to all these things. So, it's not like there's no remedy, and it's not like it's a surprise to the people that operate prisons and jails.
yeah,
So if we look at provincial and territorial prisons and jails, they are, in general, there are exceptions. So apologies to those that are exceptional, but they are exceptional. Provincial and territorial jails are crowded, chaotic,
yeah,
understaffed, underfunded.
yeah,
And so that's just a recipe for problems. It's a terrible place to work if you're a correctional officer or you work in some other role in a jail. It's a terrible place to work. It's also a terrible place to be in custody. And for anybody who thinks for a moment that these can become therapeutic environments, because there's lots of speculation now about involuntary treatment going
hmm,
on in provincial jails. If anybody for a minute thinks that a crowded, underfunded, understaffed, chaotic place can be therapeutic for somebody struggling with addiction or mental health use or a history of substance misuse, if anybody thinks that that can work, I think they need to go spend some time in a provincial or territorial jail and see
yeah,
for themselves the flaw in their thinking. These are also really, really busy places for the most part. And the staff are typically the first ones to tell you
hmm,
that they're not, there's not enough staff, there's not enough space, there's not enough recreation, not enough time in the day to do all the things they're supposed to do by law. So they triage. They
yeah,
do the best they can. It's not like our prisons are staffed by a bunch of evil people who don't want to do the right thing. That's not the case at all. So now in the federal system, there's a different issue. I would not say the federal system is underfunded.
hmm,
It's a $3 billion plus enterprise. There's about 16,000 staff, about 42 institutions. I can't remember how many parole offices across the country. It's a big system spread out all the way across coast to coast to coast. Um, but it can't seem to get out of its own way.
yeah,
It's so big that there's so much process, there's so much overhead, there's so much control coming from either regional headquarters or national headquarters, and there's that and just the pace at which things happen is very problematic. And so in the Correctional Service of Canada, it's not necessarily because they're that crowded or that chaotic or that understaffed. It's just that um, the emphasis is overwhelmingly, no matter what, on security. Now, what's wrong with that? These people are in jail. They should be secure. Well, of course they should be. But not everybody is a maximum security prisoner.
hmm,
In fact, most federally sentenced offenders are held at medium security. So that should give them greater access to programs. That should give them greater access to community-based healthcare. That should help prepare them for release in a better way, or prepare them to cascade down even to minimum security. But for whatever reason, and this has been for decades, there's a bottleneck there at medium security. There's empty bed space in minimum security. We can't seem to get people properly cascaded down. We get people still being released for parole or even at warrant expiry from a maximum security setting. So from the most secure setting onto the street, that's a recipe for failure. So we've got this bottleneck at medium security. Um, I spent more than a decade trying to diagnose that and straighten it out. I failed. And so, it's a real problem for the Correctional Service of Canada to address it and to address it in a meaningful way. And they do have the resources.
And so we talked here though about I know you explained that the rights are the same. Subject to their condition that they're in detention, so their mobility rights are restrained, obviously, and that's because of how their situation is. But is it the same thing though once a person is found guilty and is serving a sentence, or are there some changes in that
Yeah,
context?
in our conversation, I've been sort of switching back and forth
Yeah.
between trial and sentence custody. But pretty much everything I said cuts both
Hmm.
ways, pretty much. There are some things. The presumption of innocence matters,
Yeah.
and it should be respected. In fact, it should be respected more than it is. Otherwise, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have so many people in pretrial custody.
Yeah.
Those are the most crowded jails in the country. They're also the biggest jails. The two largest jails in the country together hold over 3,000 people. Now, when you think that in the entire Correctional Service of Canada, federally sentenced offenders, there's about maybe 14,000 people across the country who are federally sentenced. And on the
Hmm.
pretrial side, on the other side of
Yeah.
that continuum, um, pretrial custody, the two largest jails in the country account for about 10% of the provincial and territorial jail population, two jails. So the Edmonton Remand Center and the Toronto South Detention Center. And I've been in both. I've been in both several times. Um, there's good, there's bad, but there's mostly just ugly. It's just they're big, and as I say, noisy, chaotic. Parts of it, particularly the emissions part, tend to be very crowded. There's all kinds of perceived and real security risks. So the default is a very maximum security posture, regardless of who's coming through the door. And we know that not everybody needs to be treated the same or should be. The
Yeah.
law requires things like the least restrictive measures. The
Yeah.
principle of restraint in sentencing follows through
Yeah.
in terms of the sentence administration. So, yeah, there are some differences, but pretty much it's the same story. Your rights follow you behind the prison wall, and yet the remedy for those rights being abused is much harder to come by.
And it seems like, I mean, again, I'm just not saying this based on data or anything, but um, it seems like it's more difficult for people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds to get the services that they need. For example, language. Language is an issue. Sometimes there are some people who are detained and they don't speak either French or English, and they don't understand what's going on. They're having a hard time communicating with staff members about what they want. And
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't feel or seem like they are getting the interpretation services that they need or the language help. Uh, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a problem.
It's a very big problem. It is a very big problem. We're a very multicultural country,
Yeah.
and our prison and jail populations reflect that. Um, I mean, there's some good news. I think that the practice of identifying that as a need and a significant and important need has increased. And I
Hmm.
think there's better efforts now than certainly at the beginning of my career about making sure that people had access to somebody from their own community that could help them navigate things. Sometimes it's just a simple thing like understanding how to answer a question on a form. Um,
Right.
you know, and so I've seen improvement in that. It's far from perfect. It's far from a problem solved. And again, it's idiosyncratic. I would say the Correctional Service of Canada, by and large, is doing a better job than it used to. It's not perfect, but a better job. But I would not make the same general statement for most provinces and territories. It seems to be very site specific and sometimes even shift specific. Who's the correctional manager? Who's the deputy superintendent? Who's on shift? What time of the day is it? What day of the week is it? those things tend to really get in the way.
But then how does, let's say, an inmate who doesn't speak French or English communicate with staff members if they, let's say, they have an illness and they want to, or they have a particular condition and they want to communicate that? How can they do that in a jail
Yeah,
setting?
it's uneven. It's uneven. I've seen things as simple as somebody using like, Google Translate um, on a device. And I've seen other places where it's much more sophisticated. And there actually is, there's an immigrant serving or a newcomer serving organization that's local where they can say, do you have anybody that can speak this language?
Yeah.
And, could they show up? Could they come to the jail tomorrow and help us with this? So it's again, I see it being very, very idiosyncratic. Um, but the other thing that I've seen, quite frankly, is I've seen legal counsel really jump on this as well, in terms of also disclosure. Even if it's French and English, we have francophone first language French speaking prisoners in both systems, provincial and federal, and they may not have access to documents in a language that they can understand.
Yes.
So, that's a problem as well. Disclosure in general can be a problem. I've been in institutions that hold 700 people, and there might be one laptop that's available to share with the prisoner population so that they can view disclosure materials if they're appealing their case or their sentence. Um, so the problems in the administration of providing these rights are numerous, right? So again, there is a big gap between this legal um, reality, which is that you don't lose those rights just because
Right.
you're sentenced, and to the practical application of that principle, which is it's really hard to enforce and make sure that that happens.
But these are problems that have been going on for a while now. Like, this is not a new problem. Of course, now it's becoming, let's say, it's exacerbated by the fact that, as you mentioned, the Canadian society is very diverse, and we're having more and more people who come from other countries.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, many of these people who come from different backgrounds, they have encounters with the criminal justice system. They end up being detained and in custody. And so these are problems that have been going on for a long time, and it just doesn't seem like we have a solution for them. So I don't know what the issue here, though, is. Is it because there is no willingness to deal with that, or is it just because there is no public interest in it? Like, is it because the public at large doesn't really care about inmates? And
I think
what
it's
is
all of that. I mean, I
okay?
think it's all of that, and I think it's also just lethargy. One of my takeaways from my time again as correctional investigator is that yeah, we've got the problems, and the problems are long-standing, but we've worked around them for this long. We've dealt with it, we've coped, we do the best we can, and as long as everybody goes home at the end of the day or wakes up in the morning, then I guess everything's okay. Like nobody died tonight,
Yeah.
so it's been a good night, and we carry on. And so there's this attitude, I think, that is smacks of complacency and lethargy and just acceptance of things that shouldn't be accepted. And unfortunately, the culture in most jails and prisons is don't rock the boat. You know, don't color outside the lines, You're like so which is a huge disincentive for people to say, hey, this is wrong, we need to do something about it.
But okay, but you did mention, and I agree, that's as long as nothing major happens, then there is really no incentive to do anything if nobody died. But there are situations where there were some inmates who did die in jail.
Listen,
And
even let me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't want to leave the impression that I'm saying that attitude, that laissez-faire, lethargic, complacent attitude, I'm not saying that that's right or justifiable.
yeah,
It shouldn't even rise to the question about whether somebody died. I'm just saying that that's the mechanism that seems to explain why things are so hard to change. It can be fatal. and certainly I've done a lot of work on deaths in custody. And
And yeah,
you know, you sometimes it's really easy to say at this moment in time, this one thing happened and this led to the death. Sometimes you can do that. Most of the time you can't. Most of the time you have to look at the entire experience that that person has had in custody, and sometimes even in the community before they came into custody, to explain how they ended up dead on the floor of that cell that afternoon. And it's hardly ever just one thing. It's usually a combination of things that either went wrong or simply weren't done at all that led to that moment in time, that death. So
okay.
yeah, I hope I wasn't leaving the impression that I thought it was okay just to shrug your shoulders and look the other way. I don't think that's okay at all.
No, but even when there are some deaths that happen, do they really lead to some significant changes? Because it seems like these problems are still there, even when we do
Yeah,
have a death and there's an inquest and there are recommendations that are made for changes.
yeah. So inquests are interesting. You know, a coroner's inquest jury has the right to make a recommendation,
Yes.
doesn't have enforcement power. Correctional
Hmm.
investigator of Canada, I could make a
Yeah.
recommendation, didn't have any enforcement power. You have to be vigilant, you have to be relentless. Um, and you have to, and sometimes it just has to be a cost. And I hate to say this, but I've seen more significant change come post settlement of a very expensive lawsuit than perhaps I did on the very same issue by making a series of recommendations as correctional investigator.
Hmm.
You know, it's when the government of Canada lost in court that we finally got some action on segregation reform.
Hmm.
You know, it wasn't because of 20 years of making recommendations. Now, saying that, I should also add the lawsuits that were successful in part were based on that history of those 20 years of making
Yeah.
recommendations. So maybe it finally helped. But you know, the court, um, you know, judicial oversight now is a very important part of this conversation, because the independent oversight is important as well, and it can be effective at an individual level, resolving individual complaints and concerns, but it's very hard for it to drive systemic change. And that tends to happen more, not because a coroner's inquest said so, but because a different court said this is a problem, and the penalty for not fixing the problem is $30 million or
Yeah.
$100 or whatever. And that tends to get their attention.
So money, like if they're if they're losing money, then that's what
It's a,
will.
you know, it's a cost to the public purse. So imagine you're the director of corrections for a jurisdiction, federal, provincial,
Mhm.
territorial,
Mhm.
and some court just found that there was significant mismanagement in the way something was being done, administered, and that mismanagement has now cost that jurisdiction $30 million. What kind of conversation, as the director, as the head of corrections, you think you're going to have with your minister, or you know, or with the press, or with anybody else, right? So it is. I mean, I hate to say it, like I said, we should not be relying on a monetary penalty causing a government to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Go back to the beginning of our conversation. Those legal rights are there, and it should go without saying that government should follow the law.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, on a more positive note, though, one thing I can say, a recent improvement is some jails or detention centers that didn't have video are starting now to have videos installed where lawyers can finally communicate by video with their clients, which is, I mean, it seems like something very simple, but in the daily practice of criminal defense, it's really very important. Like I can say Central North now, I'm very happy that I can have a video call with a
Yeah,
client in Central North, which just last year I couldn't have. So
that's right.
that's really good. Not all lawyers live in the same area where their clients are detained. Sometimes, even when the client is, let's say, arrested originally in the place where the lawyer is found, they can be shipped to other jails because of the
Absolutely.
overcrowding.
Anywhere in the province. Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah,
that was a big problem, though, that there, like even the services, and that's another issue, Mr. Sapers, is that even the services that are available in jails, what we see is that they're not uniformly present in the same way. Like the video, for example, some jails have them, some don't. Now it looks like they're trying all to implement video, which is great. But not every jail has the same, offers the same services. Even if they do offer, let's say, medical care, I'm sure there are some places that have better medical
Oh
attention.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's also
You're
unfair because then, well, you're lucky also. Where is it that you end up being held in custody?
sure. How you experience incarceration will
Yeah.
very much depend on what jail or prison you're incarcerated in. That's for sure. I mean, we have some very, very, very old
Hmm.
buildings that are still being used as jails and penitentiaries, and they're just not set up to meet modern expectations
Right.
like video suites.
Yeah.
Sometimes, there are challenges, technical challenges in terms of wiring a place for Wi-Fi, for constant Wi-Fi, for interconnectivity. There's there's
Heat as well. Heating,
yeah,
like
I was
I
just going to
can,
say
yeah,
there's HVAC issues. There's access to fresh air, to daylight, to
yeah.
yards. There's food servery issues. A kitchen that was designed 50 years ago to feed 300 people is now being used 50 years later to feed 800 people.
But that's
It's
another level of unfairness as well to the
Sure.
inmates.
And so it's highly variable. A few minutes ago, I said sometimes it matters which, not just what building, but what shift, like who's on duty.
Hmm.
And so this variability, I can't tell you the number of times that I've talked to prisoners who will say, you know, when I was brought in an intake and I was talking to Correctional Officer Smith, this is what I was told. When I got assigned to my unit, and now I'm talking to Correctional
I'm
Officer
told
Jones said,
something else.
"Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not the way we do it on this unit."
Yeah. Yeah.
What can I do? I was dealing with one guy who has a CPAP machine. The only way he can sleep with a CPAP machine. He's moved from one jail to another jail for court. When he's in the one jail, they let him sleep with a CPAP machine. In the other jail, they take it away from him, say it's a security risk.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, it's highly variable
But I
and
mean,
therefore unfair. Yeah,
right. But is there isn't there any kind of standard training or a policy? I
of
mean,
course there is.
what are they operating on? Because I mean, if one says, well, that's not how it works here on this unit, but someone else allows that, well, is there a
There's tons
discrepancy?
of policy. Corrections has more policy than probably any other area of public engagement or public service. It's tons of policies, manuals. There's file boxes and file folders full of policy and interpretations on the policy and directives on the interpretations on the policy and revisions to the policy. And there's whole units of people that are hired to what they call evergreen the policy, making sure it's always current and being kept up.
Yeah.
There's tons of policy. Um, there is, however, a reality, and this is not. I didn't make this up, but there's this cliche, which is that culture eats policy for breakfast. The culture of the institution. You can have all the policy you want. You can have all the training that you want. You have all the
Hmm.
standards that you want. But if the culture of the institution is to behave in the way it chooses to behave instead of the way it's supposed to behave, then that's very hard to address. And that takes very skilled and dedicated management, and it takes oversight, and it also takes consequences. That if you don't do the job the way you're supposed to do it, that there'll be a consequence. So, absent that management vigilance and absent that dedication to doing things right, and absent the consequence, when you don't do things right, culture can overwhelm policy very quickly.
And so, what would be the best way then to make sure that there's more uniformity in the way, like these,
Well, it's just those things that I just talked about. I mean, you need to have good policy, but the
right?
policy has to be appropriate to the job. And the policy can't be created by people, that live in an ivory tower. The policy has to reflect the actual conditions in a building. And if you have a general policy statement that says everybody gets access to fresh air 4 hours a day, and you have a building that is set up in a tower, so it's on multiple floors, and you don't
Hmm.
have enough staff to physically escort those people in a reasonable and safe and managed way during a 12-hour shift. You just don't have enough staff. And then you blame the staff for not achieving the policy. That's not right. You have to recognize that the policy may be right. You're going to need more staff, and maybe you better start doing some physical renovations to the infrastructure
Well, that's
so
the
you can
thing. I
get
mean, like,
people
shouldn't the
fresh air drinking.
policy also be kind of proportional to the setting in which it's going to be applied?
Well,
Like,
I'm saying
what's
let's not mess with the policy. Let's say the policy, which is 4 hours a day fresh air.
right?
Let's say that's a great policy.
Yeah,
Nobody has that, by the way, but
yeah,
let's just say that's a
yeah,
great policy.
yeah.
Um, so the idea is you can ignore the policy because you've got these infrastructure problems, or you can address the infrastructure deficits, not not make an exception to the policy, right? On the federal side, I spent 3 years providing oversight of the implementation of these new things called structured intervention units. Well, I heard tons of excuses. Oh, we don't have enough staff. We don't have enough yards. There's not enough time in the day. Um, and so, but the Correctional Service of Canada kept on saying, well, okay, but we're not going to change the policy, and we're not going to change the infrastructure, and we're not going to, so they made little modifications here and there, and they hired some staff, but they never actually implemented the policy suite they created in the way that they created it. And that's still ongoing today. So, as I say, you need good management, you need good leadership, you need um, vigilance to make sure the job is getting done the right way. You need to train people and give them the tools to do the job the right way, and there has to be a consequence when it's not being done. And so that there's no secret sauce. There's no. It's not very complicated. You and I have accountabilities in our day-to-day work. And, there are consequences. If you don't do your job right, you could lose your right to practice,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So there are consequences. Those consequences don't seem to be very real in some settings.
Yeah, and it is frustrating because I mean, as lawyers, we receive the complaints from our clients about the conditions in the jails, about what's lacking, whether it's on the medical or any kind of problem that is going on. Lawyers can't really do much other than make arguments in court, but we can't really change. We can't go to the jail and change what's going on. So the change has to come from a different level. And it is frustrating because we hear the complaints, and it just makes me wonder, are the people who are working in the jail not aware of these complaints? Like, don't they know what's going on? Or,
I'm sure they know. Yeah. Yeah, of course they know. Again, I'll just reflect on my time as correctional investigator. I worked while I was doing that job. I think I worked with four different commissioners of corrections. So the deputy head, the leader of the Correctional Service of Canada, the operational head. And so in those four commissioners, I made a point of telling each of them, when you read my reports, when I come to you with a recommendation, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But the difference is now that I know it too, and it's going to be public. So, you may want to deal with it. And it was true. There were very few times when I actually did tell the Correctional Service of Canada something they didn't already know. Of course, they're aware.
and do you think that if there was more of a public interest in that issue, that could change something? Because I feel like the other aspect is that it doesn't seem like there's too much public interest in what happened to
Yeah.
inmate rights. So
Yeah. Well, you know what that's a very complex question. Because I'll tell you what I've come to understand. There's tremendous public interest in the administration of justice. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody talks about it. The
yeah,
stories lead on the news. They're on the front page. Things that go wrong are on the front
right.
pages of newspapers if they still exist. Um, so there's a tremendous public interest in this. Um, what there isn't is any kind of public agreement, really about what we want out of our criminal justice system. We all want to be safe. We all deserve to be safe. We all deserve to not have to worry about having our possessions stolen. Our streets should be safe for everybody to walk on any time of the day or night. These are things that are universally true. They've got nothing to do with whether you're hard on crime or soft on crime. Though these are people want to live in peace and enjoy, their public spaces. Um, but what do we expect from a jail or a prison? What do we expect the police to do? Um, on an individual basis, most Canadians still express confidence in our courts. They still express confidence in the police. And they even believe in rehabilitation and second chances. So when you
Mhm.
look at public opinion research, you get all of that. You get people want to be safe. You get they have some, there's people not that there's 100% support for the police or 100% police,
Right,
support for the courts, but more Canadians support than don't support. More Canadians trust than don't trust those public institutions. Um, so when you talk to somebody and they read a headline and they say this person was been charged for the 17th time with this same crime, and the stupid justice of the peace let them out you know, let them out on bail. The system's broken. It's a revolving door. Um, so how do you align these two sets of public
right,
perceptions? They run all these things, and then they say, "But oh, wait a minute, that was a dumb decision." Well, the fact is, they don't know anything about the circumstances of that individual or what the
right.
basis of that decision was. And the other thing we know about public opinion research is when you actually give Canadians more information,
Hmm.
they more closely align with the administration of justice as it is currently done. So, in other words, if you give people more information, they will say, oh, yeah, that person should be released on parole. Or, yeah, that person shouldn't have been in pretrial custody. I understand why they were released on bail. So, um, we have to somehow not be so much focused on public interest, because I think it's there, but on public education. We, we, we,
Yeah.
we, we have to provide people, we have to be much more transparent. We have to, first of all, admit when something's gone wrong,
Hmm.
transparent about that. We have to be transparent about our successes, and we have to be relentless in terms of educating Canadians about where their taxpayers go or their tax dollars go. We're all paying for it. So how is that money being spent? What's the benefit of that? And what's the logic behind that process or that set of decisions? And we can do a way better job of that.
So I agree. There are 2 points that I want to follow up here on that on the public education. I think one case that really portrays that is the Zamir case that we had not a long time ago, when before it got to trial and before the defense was able to provide the side of the story of the accused in that case, there was a lot of public opinion against him, and there was this idea that he
Mhm.
was a cop killer. But then, as the trial was unfolding and the facts started to come out slowly, the public changed their opinion about this individual, and they realized that it was really unfair what he had to go through. So, this is really a perfect case that shows that the information sometimes that is given to the public is not all. I mean, let's just be fair though. Some cases, sometimes there are some publication bans, and we can't, like, the media can't really give that much information, depending on the case. But sometimes
Right.
there is also some misinformation out there about
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah, yeah, true, true. Yeah, and the media is the media, and I, they do their job, and I think the system needs to tell their own stories. I don't
Hmm.
think we should be relying on, uh, a journalist
Yeah.
to be a storyteller. That's not the journalist's job. So we can, as I say, we can do a much better job of telling Canadians about their criminal justice system and just being far more transparent and far more open. And I think there'd be nothing but a net benefit to doing that.
And the other point, though, that I wanted to ask you about, it's the situation, the exact situation of the person, the repeat offender who keeps coming before the court, who keeps being. So if we have someone who keeps getting into trouble, is prison ultimately effective in that case? Is it doing anything?
This is something that's baffled me my whole career.
Hmm.
I can't think of one other enterprise where you'd keep on doing exactly the same thing and
Yeah,
expecting a different outcome,
right,
right? So we put somebody in jail and they come back to jail, and then we release them and they come back to jail again. Then we give them more jail because
right,
the until we're saying to them, look, this is the fifth time, and now I'm going to have to throw the book at you. Well, maybe you should think about what is under but behind or beneath
right.
this person's
This,
behavior.
right.
And when you look at the population, if you actually look at the population, and I'm not saying about, his parents didn't hug him enough when he was a baby. I mean, I think that's
Hmm.
a problem, but
Yeah,
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about um, if you look at the population of who's actually incarcerated,
yeah.
the overwhelming prevalence of brain injury, FASD, significant psychiatric disorder,
Hmm.
significant histories of substance misuse, significant personal histories of trauma.
Right.
If you look at all those things, then that should give you some clue about what you should be doing
Hmm.
to assist that person to not be in constant conflict with the law. And if that's not possible, to provide the kind of support and supervision in the community so that they'll have better chances of not being in conflict with the law. But to simply have them back in court, admonish them again, criminally sanction them again, sentence them again, and then do more of the same thing is just a very expensive failure on top of another very expensive failure.
Exactly. And that's the issue because also there are some people who will, or like some criticism that, well, okay, what, how is that the legal systems problem? Like it's not our problem to deal and to give therapy or to deal with their issues. But it is. If it is clogging our courts, if we keep
Yeah.
having them coming back and we have a lot of cases and we're adding this one and there's a problem that can be addressed and we can just relieve our courts from all these extra cases, I think it is our problem. Like,
No, well, it is. I mean, and from a government standpoint, if
mhm,
we raise our gaze a little bit and we say, okay, may not be the Attorney General's problem, it may not be the Solicitor General's problem, but it's certainly the government's problem.
mhm,
And there's only one taxpayer, so it's our problem too.
yeah,
So what I would say to the government is, yeah, okay, you think you're the Attorney General and you think your obligation ends at organizing the courts, hiring Crown prosecutors and funding legal aid. No, that's not, no, no, no government. That's not, Mr. Attorney General, Miss Attorney General. That may be your job, but go back to your government colleagues and what's going on with education, social services, and welfare and employment supports and housing and
yeah,
healthcare and all of those other things because we're paying for it one way or the other. And I know this to be true. If you're dealing with this population of people that are dealing with mental health issues, with substance use issues, with brain injury, with trauma, um, we're also paying for health care and social
mhm,
supports and housing supports and everything else. The most expensive way to do that is to add on the criminal justice costs.
yeah.
If we did it right, we could at least avoid those. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Well, I think we talked about quite a few problems. I hope that things will get better. I can say that I personally am very happy that there are more video options now. That really helps me in my practice as a lawyer to communicate with clients. So I hope that things will continue to get better slowly, even if it's a small step, but it will make a difference.
This whole field of endeavor is a series of small steps and
Yeah.
incremental change. But as long as it's arcing in the right direction, we should all keep at it.
And that's why
So,
it's important to keep the conversation about this subject.
yeah, so thanks. Nice to speak with you again.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Sapers.
Bye bye.